30 years after Freedmen's Bureau was established in 1868, 200-plus teachers and preachers from all across the South, many of whom came into the fullness of their inheritance after freedom precisely because of the Freedmen's Bureau, got together in Hampton, Virginia on July 25th. The 114th anniversary of that day will be Wednesday. The New York Times covered the event, called in the headline, "A Colored Man's Chances." And the whole point of this conference was to strategize, to figure out what do we need to do to forge ahead. And just so that you know I'm not making all of this up, here's an exact quote. "It is doubtful if there has ever been another such gathering as that just held here, so representative of the best elements of the Negro race, the element that stands individually and collectively for good citizenship and decent living, for education and Christianity, for self-respect developed through self-help," so on and so forth. And they split the conference up, studying everything from health and mortality, tuberculosis, the liquor problem. They called it grog shops then, the alcohols and saloons. They talked about violence in the black community. They divvied up everything so they could study it and move forward. But here's the key thing. If Reconstruction unraveled then, as we know it did, all those black people serving in elective offices were wiped out by the turn of the 20th century. All of those institutions were under attack, direct violence. Part of it was because people assumed that the hard work of challenging white supremacy and state repression and the laws in that day, they just assumed there was no more work to be done. Listen to this quote. "The far-reaching results of the conference were assured in the fact that the audiences included some 200 teachers and preachers from all over Virginia and the neighboring states, from Alabama, Tennessee, and Missouri, from north and south, who will scatter far and wide the results of deliberations and the really valuable collections of the facts." Sounds familiar, right? Sounds like just like what we're doing here today. But here's the kicker. The aim in regard to each was to find the faults for which the Negro was responsible and to see how to supply the lack or remedy. That was the whole point. The whole point was to figure out what was wrong with black people as the long shadow of Jim Crow crept across the nation. They gathered to figure out what was wrong with black people. Do you hear me? That logic, that articulation of America has cleaned the slate with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in that first Reconstruction period gave birth to a logic of post-racialism that began over 100 years ago. And the laws that were put into place then to circumscribe black people's lives, including convict leasing, including change gains, including secondary education systems, is precisely the system that gave birth to these freedom fighters right here. And yet we were gathering in those places to figure out what was wrong with us that this was happening. So just to make the connection, and I'll stop, Pew did a survey, a 2007 survey, where they asked black people what they thought about the relationship between discrimination in the 21st century and individual responsibility, community responsibility. And as it turns out, older African Americans tended to side with a critique of the structure, a critique that there were still barriers in American life and society that prevented people from living up to their true potential. But young people, more than half blamed themselves, blamed a lack of responsibility as the reason for every single gap that you're going to talk about over the next 3 days. The aim in regards was to find the fault for which the Negro was responsible. It is a gospel of victim blaming that is as ripe and real today in 2012 as it was in 1898 when all those people got together to figure out what was wrong with black people.